Out in a storm-beaten valley in Wyoming, where ranchers only talk about those darn coyotes with a loaded rifle by the door, a lone, half-starved coyote came upon a dead doe lying stiff beside a back road. Curled in the weeds beside her was a tiny fawn, shaking so hard its spotted sides fluttered, big dark eyes staring straight at the predator that should have torn it apart. That night, instead of ending a life, this coyote made a choice that went against every instinct he'd ever had. A quiet decision that would one day force ranchers, scientists, and an aging little town to rethink everything they thought they knew about monsters and about what it means to be family. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. By late January, Sagebrush Valley looked more like the far side of the moon than Wyoming. The snow had been pushed around by wind so many times it had turned to crust, a hard white shell that squeaked under any paw or boot that dared cross it. Out there, in that cold that made fence posts crack and old men's knees ache, a lone coyote moved like a shadow that had forgotten how to be warm. Rusty had not always walked alone. Once this valley had been filled with the thin, high voices of his pups, tumbling over each other in the sage and rabbit brush while their mother watched with tired, patient eyes. That was before the winter of snares and poison, before the scent of raw meat in metal jaws, the sudden snap, the frantic screaming that went on too long, before he stood on a ridge and watched his mate drag herself in a crooked circle until she finally lay down and never rose again. Now his ribs showed under his winter coat, a patchwork of scars and burrs. One ear was torn and folded, a souvenir from a fight he hadn't tried to win, only survive. His back leg hit the ground, just a little wrong, leaving a deeper stamp in the snow every few steps. Farmers in town talked about a problem coyote that kept appearing on trail cameras, and they said the word the way some people said debt collector or attorney, with a mix of anger and fear. To them, he was trouble with teeth. To Rusty, the humans were the ones with teeth, steel teeth, hidden in tall grass and baited with the smell of easy meat. He had learned the scent of metal the way people learn the fine print on a life insurance policy or a home insurance contract. Too late and at a terrible cost. These days he circled wide around anything that smelled of gasoline, oil, or the faint chemical tang of people trying to control what the land would and would not do. On the edge of the valley, in a weathered farmhouse that had seen better paint and better years, Nora Green stood at her kitchen sink and stared out into the dark. The clock over the stove blinked 11:17 p.m., and the glow from the small screen on her phone lit up a stack of envelopes. Medicare coverage updates, health insurance forms, and something about retirement planning she kept meaning to read. The wind rattled the old windows in their frames, and for a second she thought she heard a thin, lonely howl rise under the gust. She turned off the faucet and leaned closer to the glass. The yard light threw a pale yellow circle over the snow, and beyond that was just black and the vague suggestion of fence lines and cottonwood trunks. The sound came again, stretched and mournful, not near but not terribly far either. It crept over her skin the way memories do, bringing back late nights when her husband was still alive, and they'd sit at this same table with coffee, gone cold, listening to coyotes sing on the hills and laughing about how the valley was never really empty. "You still out there, you old singer?" she murmured, not sure if she meant her husband or the coyote or the valley itself. Far beyond the reach of her yard light, Rusty paused on a low rise, ears pricked. The scent of the farmhouse drifted toward him, wood smoke, fried onions, soap, and that sharp human smell of plastic and paper. Once he'd known that smell meant danger, now it just meant distance, a different world he had brushed up against but never lived in. He didn't howl back. He saved his voice for nights when his chest felt like it would burst if he kept all that emptiness inside. Tonight emptiness was not his only companion. On the wind, riding over the clean, cold scent of snow and the dusty sweetness of sage, came something else. Coppery and heavy, sharp enough to cut through everything else. Blood. Fresh, not the old dry tang of something long dead. Rusty lifted his nose higher, nostrils flaring, and turned his head slowly, testing the air again. There, down near the narrow black ribbon of county road that sliced across the valley like a scar. His stomach cramped at the smell. It had been too long since he'd eaten more than a mouse, a stolen scrap of something from a frozen field. His paws shifted without asking permission, drawing him toward the scent the way a porch light draws moths. He moved off the rise and began to trot, careful and silent, each step a measured decision on the hard crust of snow. Behind him, Nora flicked off the kitchen light and shuffled to her recliner, the envelopes and their worries still sitting unopened on the table. She never saw the gray shape slip past the far fence line, or the way it stopped once to look back at her house, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She never smelled the blood on the wind. But she would remember that thin, distant feeling in her chest, like the valley itself was holding its breath, as Rusty followed the scent down toward the road, and the accident he did not yet know had already changed his life. The county road cut through the valley with no lights and no mercy. Rusty came up on it from the low side, slipping between clumps of sage, staying just far enough back that any passing headlights would miss him. The smell of blood was strong now, thick and metallic, soaked into the snow like spilled paint. It overpowered the faint reek of exhaust and hot rubber that still hung in the air. He saw the shape of the doe first, a dark mound half in the ditch, half out on the hard-packed shoulder. One foreleg lay at an angle no living thing could keep. Steam still rose from her body in thin, ghostly wisps. Rusty stopped and watched her for a long moment, waiting for her chest to move, for an ear to twitch. Nothing. The road was empty, just a distant red smear in the snow where the taillights had vanished minutes earlier. Whoever had hit her had kept driving. People carried car insurance and life insurance and numbers for injury lawyers in their glove boxes. Out here, the deer just had bad luck. His stomach twisted so hard it made his back legs tremble. Meat. Warm, rich, more than he'd seen in weeks. His paws took him closer without asking, claws ticking once on the frozen gravel. The scent of broken bone and torn muscle hit him like a wave, and for a heartbeat all he knew was hunger. He lowered his head toward the doe's flank. Then he heard it, a sound so small it could have been the wind, except the wind didn't shiver. A thin, catching bleat, like a door hinge that couldn't quite open. Rusty's head snapped up. The cry came again from the tangle of sage and snow just beyond the ditch. He left the doe where she lay and stepped toward the brush, placing each paw carefully. There, wedged against a clump of brittle stems, stood a fawn. Its legs looked too long for its body, spotted coat spattered with snow and mud. Big dark eyes stared at him, wide and glassy. It tried to stand taller, to put itself between Rusty and the still form of its mother, but its knees shook so badly the whole body quivered. The fawn didn't know enough to be properly afraid. It smelled of milk and fear and the damp, grassy scent of the doe's belly. Rusty could hear its breathing, fast and shallow, like a bird trapped in a jar. He took another step, and the fawn flinched, but didn't run. There was nowhere to go. In his mind, something shifted. The sharp red hunger that had driven him here bumped up against an older memory, one he had tried not to touch. Tiny bodies pressed against his belly for warmth, the high, piping squeaks of his own pups when snow crept into the den. The way they had cried when snares took their mother. He remembered licking frost from stiff fur, nudging them closer, staying awake all night while the cold crept in like an unpaid bill. The world narrowed to two choices, meat or voice. fill the emptiness in his gut, or quiet the sound that scraped across old scars. He stepped back to the doe and lowered his head again, this time with a strange, careful deliberation. His teeth slid into the flesh high on her haunch, away from the fawn's line of sight. He tore off a strip of meat and swallowed it almost whole, then another, just enough to stop the shaking in his legs. The warmth spread through his chest, thick and guilty. When he had taken what he needed to stand without falling, Rusty did something no one in any office worrying over health insurance forms or retirement planning would ever see on a brochure. He gripped the doe's leg and dragged her a little farther down into the ditch, tucking her body deeper into the shadow of the embankment, out of the open, away from the easy nose of passing scavengers. Then he went back to the fawn. Up close he could see ice crusting on its ears, tiny crystals catching what little light leaked from the sky. Its knees nearly folded when he approached, but it stayed planted between him and its mother's scent. He lowered his head, not to bite, but to breathe in that small, terrified warmth. The fawn's sides fluttered under its skin like trapped wings. Rusty shifted, turning so his flank blocked the wind that scoured across the road. He leaned in, pressing his rough fur lightly against the fawn's trembling body. The little creature stiffened, then, as another gust cut through, inched closer on unsteady legs. Rusty let out a low, rumbling breath, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. Snow began to fall again, soft and fine, covering the tire tracks and the red spray on the shoulder. Out there, between the dead mother and the black strip of asphalt, a starving coyote and an orphaned fawn stood shoulder to shoulder, both of them shaking, both of them still alive. Rusty didn't know why he had spared it, didn't know what tomorrow would demand of either of them. He only knew that for this one cold moment he would not add one more broken voice to the long list already echoing in his memory. The wind picked up after midnight, sliding down off the low hills and pouring across the valley in long, cold rivers. Out by the roadside, the orphaned fawn's thin legs finally buckled. It sagged against Rusty's shoulder, the small body knocking clumsily into his ribs. He shifted his weight and braced, surprised by how little it weighed, like wind-stirred grass wrapped in skin. The doe lay still in the ditch behind them, already losing her warmth to the frozen air. Rusty looked once over his shoulder, then away. Whatever comfort she had left, he had taken. There was nothing more he could do for the dead. The living pressed against him, shivering. Another gust tore across the open stretch, driving needles of snow into his face. The road was no place to spend a night, not for a coyote, and certainly not for a creature that could barely stand. Rusty nudged the fawn's neck, then stepped away from the asphalt, moving slowly so it could follow. It took a few stumbling steps, then slipped, knees folding. Rusty circled back, bumped its shoulder with his chest, coaxing it up again. Step, slip, shiver. Step, slip, shiver. Bit by bit, they left the dead doe and the smell of hot rubber behind. He led it toward the darker shape he knew from long habit, the big cottonwood that grew near the sagging fence line of Nora Green's place. The tree had stood through more winters than any of them. Roots, sunk deep into a strip of soil the plow had never reached. Its bare branches scratched at the night like fingers. Beneath it, the snow drifted but did not bite as hard, the wind broken into smaller, kinder pieces. By the time they reached the trunk, the fawn was breathing in fast, ragged bursts, sides heaving. Rusty slowed, and then lay down in the shallow dish of snow where he'd sometimes curled up alone, nose to tail, to ride out the worst of the weather. He looked back at the fawn, and after a moment's hesitation, let out a low, throaty sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a call. An invitation, as close as he could manage. The fawn took one more uncertain step and folded down beside him, legs collapsing underneath. It kept its head up for as long as it could, eyes fixed on him, then finally let its chin rest on the curve of his shoulder. Rusty could feel every tremor run through that fragile body. He shifted closer, pressing his flank against it, pulling its small heat into the hollow between his chest and the tree's rough bark. Back at the farmhouse, the old clock in Nora's living room chimed the quarter hour with a tired little ping. Sleep would not come. She sat in her recliner with a quilt over her knees, the TV turned down low, some commercial about retirement planning and life insurance flickering blue across her wallpaper. She wasn't listening. Her ears were tuned to the wind and that thin feeling again, as if something out there was happening just beyond the edge of human business in paper forms. On impulse, she pushed herself up and shuffled to the front door, unlatching it and opening it a crack. Cold air spilled in, carrying the distant smell of snow and sage, and something else she couldn't name. For a second, as she peered out across the yard, she thought she saw movement by the far cottonwood, a darker shadow against the dark, a shape that might have been a dog curled around a smaller, paler lump. She blinked, and her eyes watered in the wind. The shapes blurred back into ordinary night. "You're seeing things, old girl," she muttered, closing the door and turning the deadbolt. Time to quit watching those wildlife shows before bed. Outside, under the cottonwood, Rusty kept his head up a long time. Owls moved noiselessly from post to post, and once a pickup rattled by far down the road, its headlights sweeping the snow with indifferent light. Each time a sound rose above the wind, he pricked his good ear and lifted his nose, testing the air for danger. The fawn slept in fits, jerking awake at any sharp noise, only to press closer against him when it realized the cold was waiting on the other side. Eventually, even Rusty's vigilance began to fray. The steady thump of the fawn's heartbeat against his ribs, the slow drift of snow building a soft wall around their bodies, the deep, bone-level fatigue of too many hungry days, all of it pulled him downward. His eyes closed, opened, closed again. He let his chin sink onto his paws, still angled so that if anything approached from the open field, his nose would find it first. By dawn, a thin gray light seeped into the valley. The storm had passed, leaving a smooth, pale skin over everything. A small brown head lifted under the tree, ears twitching. The fawn blinked, disoriented, then felt the warmth against its side and settled slightly. Rusty was already awake, though he hadn't moved. He could feel stiffness in his legs and a familiar hollow ache in his belly. But there was something else now, too. The weight of a choice he didn't understand but could no longer take back. The wind had dropped. Somewhere, far off, a crow called. Rusty eased himself upright, careful not to jostle the fawn more than he had to. It struggled to its feet beside him, weaker than before, but still willing. He glanced once toward the farmhouse where a curl of smoke was just beginning to rise from Nora's chimney, and then toward the low hills beyond. Between those two worlds, in the thin strip of no-man's land by the cottonwood and the fence, he pointed his nose toward the day. Without looking back at the road or the body in the ditch, the lone coyote stepped out, and the orphaned fawn followed, their tracks stitching together across the fresh snow as if they'd been walking side by side all their lives. By the time the snow had softened and refrozen a few more times, Sagebrush Valley looked stitched together with tracks. Deer trails crossed rabbit runs, and here and there a single coyote path wound between them, looping past old fence posts and half-buried rocks. On the backside of Nora Green's property, along a sagging stretch of barbed wire, no one bothered to fix any more. A metal box no bigger than a paperback watched it all without blinking. Ethan Miller had bolted that box to a fence post in late fall, just before Thanksgiving. He'd told himself the trail cameras were for a new photo project, something to keep him busy now that he was closer to retirement and farther from the thrill of chasing wildfires and breaking news with a camera on his shoulder. The truth was, he didn't like sitting at the kitchen table all evening, comparing health insurance plans and worrying about mortgage rates on his small house in town. Watching deer and coyotes wander past his lens felt like a better use of whatever time he had left. On a gray Saturday morning, he sat at his desk with a mug of coffee, going cold at his elbow, and a little stack of memory cards beside his laptop. Outside, Main Street was quiet. A couple of pickups rolled past the window, headed out toward the ranches. Ethan slid the first card into the slot, clicked through a few folders, and started the slideshow he knew by heart. Night shots of raccoons, a fox or two, the usual procession of whitetails drifting like ghosts between the junipers. He was halfway through the second card when something made him lean closer. The frame showed the fence, lying under a nearly full moon. A coyote stood there, thin and ragged, one ear folded. Ethan recognized it. This was the same problem dog the ranchers had been griping about at the diner. The coyote's head was turned slightly, as if listening. Behind it, half hidden by its shadow, a small shape hugged the fence post. Ethan clicked to the next frame. The coyote had moved ahead a few feet. The small shape had unfolded into legs, a fawn, spotty coat glimmering faintly in the infrared light. It walked right at the coyote's hip, close enough that their bodies almost brushed. He sat back, then leaned in again. Click. The next image showed both animals at the edge of the frozen creek, the coyote lowering its head to drink while the fawn did the same, copying the angle exactly. Click. Now the coyote stood, ears pricked, staring into the dark, while the fawn pressed its nose into the rough fur of the coyote's neck. "That's not right," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the empty room. He replayed them twice, 3 times, checking the timestamps. Same night, same camera, no glitches. He'd seen strange things through a lens over the years, but never a predator and prey moving together like a pair of old ranch dogs. His mind, trained to look for edits and tricks in an age of credit card scams and too-good-to-be-true online deals, tried to find the seam, and couldn't. He pulled his phone from his pocket and thumbed through his contacts until he landed on Mia Parks, Game and Fish. A few minutes later, he was sitting at his kitchen table, laptop turned toward the center, while Mia watched the slideshow with her arms folded tight across her chest. "Could be some glitch," she said at first. "Double exposure or something. These little trail cams, they're not exactly top-shelf tech." "Look at the footprints in the snow," Ethan said quietly. "One set of coyote, one set of deer, same path, same stride. That's not a glitch." Mia didn't answer. When the frame came up where the coyote's tongue was caught mid-lick against the fawn's forehead, her mouth actually dropped open a little. They sat through the rest in silence. At the end, she let out a breath she'd been holding. "Well," she said slowly, "if this is real, Claire needs to see it." That afternoon, Dr. Claire Hart drove out from the small university 2 towns over, her old station wagon humming like a tired refrigerator. She carried a notebook, a thermos, and the kind of curiosity that had kept her in field work long after most of her peers had settled into safer, better-paying desk jobs and started talking about retirement planning. She watched the footage twice, took notes in a hand that got smaller when she was excited, and then asked Ethan to show her exactly where the camera was. By dusk, there were 3 cameras on that fence line instead of 1, all of them checked and re-aimed with care. Ethan's breath fogged in the cold as he tightened straps and tested motion sensors. Mia walked the perimeter, noting tracks. Claire stood a little apart, studying the ground with a thoughtful frown. "You realize," she said finally, "if this is what it looks like, it's going to change the way a lot of people around here think about coyotes." Mia snorted. Dawson's not going to cancel his home insurance just because some coyote decided to play babysitter. "No," Claire agreed, But if a predator can choose to protect instead of kill, even once, that's a story worth telling and worth documenting properly. They left the fence line as the first stars pushed through the dark. Out beyond the reach of their truck headlights, two animals moved through the snow, a battered coyote and a fawn that kept brushing against his side, as if the safest place in the whole wide valley was right there, next to the jaws that should have ended her life. The cameras watched, red lights winking, ready to prove to anyone who cared to look that sometimes the rules of the wild bent in ways no one expected. By early March, the spots on the little fawn's coat had begun to fade, melting into a soft, pale brown that matched the hills when the snow pulled back. She had outlived the worst of the winter, which was more than most people in town would have bet on, but she was not quite any one thing anymore. When she moved through the draw behind Nora Green's place, she didn't float like the other deer. She crept. Dr. Claire Hart was the first one to give her a name. It's easier to keep track of individuals when you call them something besides Subject A, she told Ethan and Mia one afternoon, huddled over a laptop in Ethan's kitchen. Let's call her Lily. Lily? Mia raised an eyebrow. She lives in sagebrush and cactus. Exactly, Claire said. Pretty thing in a rough place. On the screen, Lily nosed aside a drift of old snow to reach the tender shoots underneath. Rusty stood a few feet away, head up, watching the horizon. Every so often he'd take a step, and Lily would take one too, matching him without even looking, as if some invisible rope tied her to his ribs. Out in the valley, away from the quiet flicker of video playback and the low hum of Ethan's old refrigerator, the lessons went on. Rusty showed Lily where the creek cut a narrow trench through the meadow, the water hidden under a skin of ice. He stepped down carefully, testing each patch with his weight before letting her follow. When a gust of wind shifted, he stopped dead, nose high, waiting for the new smell to sort itself into friend, foe, or nothing. Lily watched his tail, his ears, the way his muscles locked, and began to pause in the same places, as if danger had seeped into the snow itself. She grazed when the grass showed, head down and chewing, but she never let herself drift the way other deer did. There was always one ear turned toward the place where Rusty had last been. At night, instead of bedding down in the open with the stars above, she curled under low branches or beside old logs, tucking herself into the same tight arcs Rusty used, nose pressed into her own flank, hooves ready to push off at the first snapped twig. One evening, as the light thinned to a blue-gray hush, another coyote slipped into their part of the world. He was younger than Rusty, broader in the chest, with a thick winter coat that hadn't yet been ripped by fences or bad choices. His eyes caught the faint glow from town and glimmered with a hard, hungry curiosity. He smelled deer and followed it, paws barely whispering on the crusted snow. Lily was alone, tugging at a clump of dry grass that had somehow stayed green under the drift. Rusty was a little way off, worrying a frozen vole out of its tunnel. The stranger came in low and fast, head stretched forward, tail straight, every line of his body saying, "Hunter." Lily froze, the stalk of grass still hanging from her mouth. Rusty saw him a heartbeat before the stranger lunged. The fight was messy and short and deadly serious. Rusty hit the younger coyote from the side, teeth catching his shoulder, momentum carrying them both into the snow with a hard thump. They rolled, snarling, jaws snapping inches from each other's throats. Lily bolted at the first impact, but only far enough to stand behind a fallen log, eyes wide, hooves digging trenches in the softening snow. The younger animal came up on top once, twice, trying to drive his teeth down into Rusty's neck, but Rusty fought like someone who had already lost everything and wasn't about to lose one more thing without a say. He twisted, took a deep cut along his own shoulder, then got his teeth into the tender skin of the intruder's muzzle and held on. Shock and pain did what age and size could not. The stranger yelped, kicked free, and ran limping into the scrub, leaving a few tufts of fur and a crooked line of bloody paw prints behind. Rusty stood panting, sides heaving, new blood soaking into old scars. Lily crept back to him in tiny steps, neck stretched, nostrils flaring. When she reached his side, she pressed her nose to the wound on his shoulder, flinched at the smell, then stayed there anyway, as if her small presence could plug the leak. On the next set of trail camera pictures, Ethan and Claire saw the fresh tear in Rusty's hide. They watched him limp a little more on that bad leg, watched Lily walk so close to his hip that their shadows on the snow became one shape. "It's not just that he didn't eat her," Ethan said quietly. "He's getting beat up because of her." Claire didn't answer right away. She was thinking of all the lectures she'd given over the years about predator-prey dynamics, about how nature didn't make room for sentiment. She was also thinking about the stack of student loan statements on her desk back at the university, the life insurance flyer for state employees she'd shoved into a drawer, all the ways humans tried to calculate risk and protection on paper. Out here, a battered coyote had done the math another way and come up with something no policy could cover. Across the road and a couple of fences away, Tom Dawson counted 3 dead lambs in 1 week and saw only one number: loss. Coyotes were to blame in his mind, no camera footage needed. He'd worked too long and too hard on this land to watch his investment walk away on 4 legs. That night, under a sky full of indifferent stars, he baited his steel traps with meat and set them along the edges of his pasture, jaw springs gleaming dull in the moonlight. He didn't know there was a coyote in the valley who had already chosen to save a life instead of take it. To him, a coyote was a coyote, and trouble was trouble, no matter what any scientist's camera said. By the time the last dirty piles of snow shrank back into the shade of fence posts and rocks, Lily had changed again. Her spots were gone, replaced by a smooth tan coat that matched the dry grass waving on the hills. From a distance, she looked like any young doe in Sagebrush Valley. But up close, the differences showed in the way she moved. Other deer flowed. Lily checked. She had grown longer in the leg, taller at the shoulder, almost level now, with Rusty's back. When they walked the draws behind Nora Green's place, she still kept close to his hip, but there was a restless edge to her, like a kid standing in the doorway between 2 rooms and not quite sure which one to step into. The air had changed. It carried new smells, damp soil, wild plum blossoms, and something else that tugged hard at her instincts, the musk and warm green scent of a whole herd of deer grazing together in Nora's lower pasture. At dusk, they appeared like a line of shadows that decided to solidify. 10, 12, more. Does and yearlings and a few yearling bucks whose antlers were only bumps under the skin. They moved with the easy confidence of animals who knew they belonged in a group. They nipped at fresh shoots, flicked their tails, bumped shoulders without thinking about it. From the cover of a line of scrub, Lily watched them with her ears straight up, every muscle tilted forward. Rusty watched her. He didn't understand the pull, not the way she felt it, but he knew the look of something being called away. He had seen it when his own pups first sniffed the edge of the den and realized the world was bigger than the warm circle of their mother's body. Lily shifted her weight from hoof to hoof, backing up a step, moving forward another, torn by something neither of them could see. One warm evening, as the sun slid down behind the low hills and turned the sky the color of an old bruise, Rusty settled under the cottonwood with his sore leg tucked close. The day's limp had been worse. One of Dawson's traps had snapped shut and scraped his paw a few days earlier, and the ache ran deep now. Lily paced for a while, looking from him to the glow of the herd in the distance. When he finally closed his eyes, just for what he thought would be a moment, she made her choice. She stepped away. Her hooves made almost no sound on the soft ground. She slipped through the broken fence like a shadow pouring through a crack, then out across the open, heart thudding. The scent of the other deer grew stronger with every breath. It smelled like grass and safety and something old and right, like the feeling people get when they find an old family photo in a box while cleaning out a house for a real estate sale or sorting papers for retirement planning. Somewhere deep in her bones, Lily knew this was where she was supposed to be. The herd noticed her before she reached them. Heads lifted, ears flared, bodies stilled. For a few heartbeats there was only quiet curiosity. She looked like them, after all. Lily slowed, lowering her head in the polite, submissive way deer use when approaching their own. Then the wind shifted. It carried with it the sharp, wild smell that clung to her fur. Coyote, close, and recent. The lead doe's nostrils flared. Her eyes widened, not in welcome, but in alarm. She stamped a front hoof hard enough to send a little puff of dust into the air and blew out a sharp, snorting call that every deer in the valley understood. Predator. The change was instant. Bodies bunched, muscles tensed. A young buck with budding antlers lunged toward Lily, not quite striking her, but close enough that she felt the whoosh of air as his hooves came down. Another doe swung her head, ears pinned back, and drove at Lily's side, driving her away from the center of the group like a bad thought. Lily stumbled, shocked. She tried again, turning sideways, head low, offering every signal she knew that said, "I won't hurt you." But the smell on her was wrong, written all through her. To them she was something that had been rolled in danger, a walking contradiction that set every instinct shrieking. The buck lunged once more, this time his shoulder catching Lily's hip. Pain jolted up her leg. Confusion cracked into fear. She turned and ran, not toward the trees, not toward the hills, but back along the path her own tracks had just marked, back toward the only warm shape that had ever stood between her and the cold. Under the cottonwood, Rusty jerked awake at the sound of hooves pounding the earth. Lily burst through the fence gap, sides heaving, eyes rolling white. She skidded to a stop and pressed herself against him so hard he rocked on his bad leg. Over her shoulder, he could see the herd in the distance, bunched tight, watching but not following. They didn't want her dead. They just wanted her gone. Lily's chest rose and fell against his ribs. Rusty could smell the other deer on her, layered under his own scent, like two names written on the same piece of paper. She belonged to both and to neither. He lowered his head and touched his nose briefly to the sore place on her hip, then turned his gaze back to the darkening pasture. In town that night, folks flipped channels between news about mortgage rates and ads for health insurance, unaware that out in the valley, a young deer had just discovered that sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't being alone. It's finding out that the place you thought was yours doesn't recognize you anymore, and the only comfort you have left waits under a worn old tree beside a limping coyote who should have been your worst enemy, but somehow became your home. Spring didn't come all at once to Sagebrush Valley. It leaked in around the edges, snowbanks shrinking, creeks waking up, a different kind of bird calling from the willows. Along with it came a new sound that didn't belong there at all, a long, rolling howl from the north that made even Rusty's fur stand on end. Wolves! They'd been rumors at first. A rancher swore he'd seen tracks bigger than any dog's along his fence line. A trucker passing through said he'd caught yellow eyes in his headlights that weren't coyote, weren't anything he'd ever seen that far south. At the diner in town, men shook their heads over their coffee, talking about livestock, home insurance, and how nobody could afford one more thing to worry about on top of rising gas prices and mortgage rates. Rusty knew before any of them. He smelled the strangers on a damp morning, sharp and heavy, riding down from the higher ridges. Their scent wrapped around every bush and rock they passed, bold and careless. Wolves didn't have to sneak. They were big enough to let the world know they'd arrived. For a few days, the wolves stayed high, following elk and mule deer. Their voices floated down at night, deep and layered. A chorus Rusty answered only once, with a short, defiant bark that carried more warning than welcome. Lily pressed against his side each time the distant howls rose, ears flat, her own instincts torn between fear of predators and the pull toward her own kind in the lower pasture. Tom Dawson heard the wolves, too, and drew a straight line in his mind from those howls to the lambs he'd already lost. To him, predator was predator. If the government wasn't going to protect his flock, he'd do it himself. He set out more steel traps, this time dusting the bait with a cheap powder he'd ordered online, some over-the-counter poison that didn't require a lawyer to sign off on it. While he worked, the radio in his truck muttered about life insurance and retirement planning, voices promising safety he didn't quite believe in. He trusted springs and steel and his own two hands more than any policy. One evening, Rusty and Lily slipped along the edge of Dawson's pasture the way they always did to reach a stand of new grass near the creek. The wind was wrong that night, lazier than usual, and Rusty didn't catch the sour chemical tang until Lily had already lowered her head toward a chunk of meat that lay too perfectly in her path. He moved faster than his bad leg liked. In 2 bounds he was between her and the bait, teeth snapping as he flung the chunk aside. It skidded through the frost and bumped against the iron jaw of a half-buried trap. The smell hit him full on then, bitterness layered over blood. His lip curled. He stamped a paw down instinctively in front of Lily to hold her back, and the earth gave way. The trap didn't catch him full, not this time, but one heavy jaw slammed shut along his toes, scraping skin and bone before it bounced open again. Rusty yelped more from shock than pain and jerked his foot free, leaving a smear of blood on the metal and the snow. Lily danced in panic around him, not knowing where to put her feet. Up at the house, Dawson glanced toward the pasture when he thought he heard something, but the sound was swallowed by the wind and the low murmur of the television. Some commercial was talking about health insurance, deductibles, and peace of mind. He turned up the volume and limped to his recliner, never knowing that out in the dark, an animal he'd never met had just taken the hit meant for something small and spotted and innocent. Rusty licked at his foot until the worst of the bleeding stopped. Each step after that was a hot, white jab up his leg, but he kept moving, herding Lily away from the pasture, away from the glittering teeth hidden in the grass. He steered them toward higher ground, where the air tasted cleaner and the old cottonwood stood like a sentinel. The wolves came lower that night. Their howls were closer, threaded with excitement. They'd scented the same things Rusty had: lamb, deer, fear. A thin, icy rain began to fall, needling into fur and soaking the top layer of soil. Far above, clouds were stacking in thick, bruise-colored layers, the kind that didn't just pass over, they settled in and stayed. The weather radio in Nora Green's kitchen crackled out words like front moving through and severe system, but to Rusty it meant something simpler, a storm big enough to change things. On a hill overlooking the valley, he stopped and looked back. Lights from houses pricked the dark like little promises humans made to themselves: home insurance, bank accounts, credit card limits, ways to keep bad luck at bay. Down below, somewhere in those shadows, the wolves moved, and the traps waited with their poisoned bait. Lily stood shoulder to shoulder with him, head turned toward the faint shapes of the deer herd in Nora's pasture and the flicker of the farmhouse windows. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of wet wool, sharp metal, and a storm gathering its strength. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Rusty's paw throbbed with every heartbeat. The easy choice, the wild choice, would have been to take Lily up into the rocks and leave the lower ground to the wolves and the men with their traps. But as he listened to the distant voices rolling over the hills, he understood, in the simple way animals do, that danger was walking straight toward the only place Lily might one day belong. He lowered his head, sniffed the wind one more time, and started back down the slope, limping into the teeth of the rising storm, with Lily close behind, as if he meant to meet whatever was coming halfway. The storm came in like a freight train after dark. Wind roared down the valley, pushing sheets of cold rain that turned to stinging pellets of sleet, then back to rain again. Lightning stitched jagged white lines across the sky, and thunder rolled so close it shook windows in town and rattled coffee mugs in their cupboards. Out in Nora Green's lower pasture, the deer herd broke. One flash of lightning, one crack of thunder too close, and they scattered in all directions, white tails flagging in the dark. Fences that were easy to see in daylight became traps. Gullies filled with rushing water. Lily ran with them at first, swept along by the flood of hooves and muscle, but a sideways leap from another doe shoved her toward the edge. She found herself alone near the fence line, sides heaving, the world reduced to wind, water, and the smell of panic. Under the noise of the storm, another sound moved in. Paws in wet grass, low, hungry breaths. The wolves had come down off the ridges, their timing as cruel and perfect as any accident on that county road months before. They fanned out, gray shadows against the darker night, circling the scattered deer. One peeled off toward Lily, drawn by the tangle of scents on her coat. Deer, coyote, fear. Lily backed up until her haunches brushed wire. Lightning lit up the world in harsh white, and for a split second she saw the wolf clearly. Yellow eyes, open jaws, rain dripping from the tips of its fur. Then the dark slammed down again, and all she had was the sound of its feet and the hot rush of her own breathing. From the slope above, Rusty had been watching the storm chew its way across the valley. He'd seen the herd burst apart like a dropped basket of apples. Now, through the rain and the burn in his bad paw, he caught the smell that mattered most. Lily, alone, cornered. He didn't think about it. Coyotes don't have retirement planning or life insurance charts taped to their walls. They have heartbeats and instincts and the memory of what they can't stand to lose. Rusty dropped his head, tucked his tail for balance, and ran. The trail cameras later showed only pieces. One frame caught Lily half-turned, eyes wide, the wolf a blurred streak, lunging toward her. The next caught another shape slamming into the wolf's side, knocking it off course. Rusty, all ribs and scars and soaked fur, teeth bared in a snarl bigger than his whole body. After that, the storm took over. Sheets of sleet flashed white in the infrared, obscuring everything. Now and then a muzzle appeared, jaws open, a tangle of legs, a spray of dark drops that weren't rain. In Nora's kitchen, the power flickered but held. She sat in her chair and listened to the wind and the weather radio talking about downed lines and folks to call if your home insurance policy covered storm damage. She thought, not for the first time, about how small people were under a sky like that. Somewhere beyond her frosted window, the valley was rewriting a story no policy could touch. By morning, the storm had limped east. The air smelled scrubbed, raw, and clean. Mia and Ethan drove out with Claire to check the cameras and the fence lines. They found the first sign near the cottonwood, tracks churned into mud, deep gouges where claws had dug in, and here and there tufts of gray fur that weren't deer. Farther on, near the pasture fence, the mud told the rest. Wolf tracks, circling, then veering away. A single coyote trail, staggered and smeared with blood, led off toward the low hills, and then simply stopped. No body, just a few more hairs caught on a sage branch, tugged loose by the night. Lily stood with the herd in the new morning light, not at the center, but not on the very edge either. When Mia raised her binoculars, she saw Lily flinch at the sound of a distant truck, then calmly guide herself and the deer nearest her toward the shelter of a shallow dip in the field, as if she knew that flat, open ground and straight lines spelled danger. Claire watched her move and scribbled notes that didn't quite capture the lump in her throat. Months turned into years, as they tend to do when no one is looking. The valley rolled through more winters and more springs. One bright June morning, a trail camera caught Lily again, older now, body filled out, flanked by two wobble-legged fawns of her own. She led them along the fence line, not out in the middle of the pasture. When a pickup rattled down the distant road, she stopped, ears sharp, and hustled the little ones into a shallow ditch until the sound faded. Only then did she let them climb back up to graze. On a local TV segment about wildlife research and conservation grants, Claire sat in a plain office and tried to explain it all in words simple enough for the evening news. How a coyote many folks had called a nuisance had once chosen to protect a fawn instead of kill it, had fought wolves and braved traps so that she could grow up and pass on those hard-earned lessons. Viewers heard predator, prey, survival, mixed in between commercials for health insurance and new trucks, and some of them looked out their own windows a little differently that night. The biggest surprise wasn't in the university report, though. It was at the county meeting where they discussed fencing and a small wildlife corridor along the creek. When the clerk read out the first name on the petition in favor, it was Tom Dawson. The same man who'd once scattered poison and steel now stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "We've got enough enemies in this world without picking fights with the ones that save us from the things we don't understand." He was the one who suggested, almost shyly, that they call the corridor Rusty's Pass. That evening, as the sun slid down and painted the cottonwood in gold, Nora stepped out onto her porch with a cup of tea. Her bills were still stacked by the phone, Medicare letters and bank statements waiting. But for the moment, she just listened. The valley lay quiet and green. Somewhere far up on the ridge, a single thin howl rose and fell, then faded into the wind. "Good night, old singer," she said softly. She couldn't have known for sure if it was Rusty or one of his kind, or only her memory filling in the gaps. But down in the pasture, Lily lifted her head at the same instant, ears turning toward that lonely sound, and for one long heartbeat, Coyote and Deer and the woman on the porch all seemed to be listening to the same invisible thread, one that tied a so-called monster to the lives he'd changed long after his own trail had washed away. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.